Well, hello. Today on Illuminist History, we're going to be looking into the tradition of Sufism. One aspect of being is unity, the unity of being. By definition, it is all-encompassing. Anything that is, anything that has being, is part of the unity of being. There's something about us as beings, as participants in the unity of being, that is nurtured as we recognize the unity, as we reflect on the unity, as we abide in the recognition of unity. I can remember how early in my personal acquaintance with Sufism, when I was a regular participant in the Dances of Universal Peace in New Orleans, after the dance meeting, we would often wind up at the very bohemian and now semi-legendary Borsodi's Coffee House. And I remember seeing on a bathroom wall there something that could very well have been written by one of the people in our little group. It said, "We are one," in big letters. And then in little letters beside it, someone had written, "Not me, you maybe, not me." There are certain obstacles to talking about unity and certain obstacles to talking about Sufism. One person speaks of unity because they know it to be a blessing. But another person hears it, feels into their own sense of separateness, and comes to the conclusion that they're being criticized or challenged or judged. And anyway, it feels like far too intimate a subject for another person to broach without express permission, like pillow talk encroaching on a casual everyday conversation. People sometimes don't speak of Sufism because that passage from the Tao Te Ching comes to mind. Those who know don't say, and those who say don't know. Everyone can recognize a sense in which this is true from who talked about getting laid in high school and who didn't have to say anything. But I think that in our present day, there's a sense in which that old adage can be harmful. Okay, there are a few people out there who know, genuinely, indisputably know. And perhaps there are a few people out there who know nothing. Almost everybody else is somewhere in between. We know to a degree, we don't know to a degree. Do we resign ourselves to speaking only from our ignorance, convinced that speech plays no role in the collective cultivation of wisdom? It seems to me that that's going too far. There are people with great wisdom out there, although looking at the news some days, it doesn't seem like it. Others have learned from people of great wisdom or know of people of great wisdom. And while there's always a danger of getting ahead of ourselves, I think there's value in voicing appreciation for greater wisdom than our own. Another difficulty one encounters in talking about Sufism as a Westerner has to do with its relationship to Islam, especially because Muslim Sufi practitioners are not always in the same opinion on the subject. When I was first investigating Sufism as a young guy in the early 80s, the teachings I came across from sources like Idris Shaw and Pir Vilayat Khan treated Sufism as a universal and universalist phenomenon that transcended all creeds, times, and nations, emerging from the underlying ground of being that is none other than the source of us all. And with those as my early influences, that's still my default perspective. But there's a lot that's changed in the world since then. And it's been pointed out by authorities of spiritual traditions from all over the world that perennialism, or the idea that all of humanity's spiritual expressions are just facets of a single underlying truth, often goes hand in hand with an attitude of colonialism or cultural appropriation. Are you, for instance, a Tibetan Lama who thinks that Buddhism isn't ultimately the same as Advaita Vedanta? Well, then you're just not seeing the big picture, but we can teach you. So nowadays, it seems pretty clear that the majority of Sufi lineages assume that Sufism is intrinsically Islamic, that if you want to study Sufism, you should either be Muslim to start with or at least become Muslim before too long. That in itself imposes no necessary obstacle to discussing Sufism if we happen to be non-Muslim. We can talk about this interesting thing that happens within the context of our Muslim neighbors. Except that we do not have, except that we do have the minority of Sufi lineages that would say that being non-Muslim is no impediment to following the Sufi way, if our minds are open and our hearts fill with love of the divine. This doesn't prevent us from speaking, but it's an ambiguity that we have to accept moving forward. The most important question is, can you find in the teaching a calling to your divine home? And if so, resolving these kinds of doctrinal decisions is up to you. And just so there's no confusion, while I've had the good fortune at various times of my life to spend time in the foothills with followers of the Sufi way, I'm not speaking here as a Sufi or a follower of Sufism. I'm an Illuminist and an esotericist. There's a term for esotericist in Arabic, a batini, one who participates in batiniya, esotericism. That is to say, one who is always looking for the underlying truth. Batinis aren't usually held in high esteem among Muslims, the idea being Islam is the underlying truth. If you encounter Islam and you still seek the truth underlying it, you haven't understood Islam. Maybe that's true, but that is who I am. Still, I am a Batini with the highest admiration for Sufism, and I'm really happy to have the opportunity to discuss it here tonight. With that in mind, let's begin with the opening surah of the Quran, the Fatiha, or the opener. In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. Praise be to God, Lord of the worlds, the compassionate, the merciful, Master of the day of judgment. Thee we worship, and from thee we seek help. Guide us upon the straight path, the path of those whom thou hast blessed, not of those who incur wrath, nor of those who are astray. This surah is considered to be the essence of the entire Quran. It's also called the mother of the book, or the mother of the Quran. So everything is here. It sets the tone, it sets the attitude. It's the opening in the sense of it's the opening to the book, the preface, the introduction to the book, but it's the opening in that it can open you to the message. If you happen to be able to recite it in Arabic, you can, if you're in the Holy Land, you can be admitted into the Dome of the Rock. They will assume if you've taken the, if you know at least that much, you qualify to enter. Muhammad received the Quran over 19 years, from 609 to 632 Common Era, starting in the cave of Hira, which is pictured. It was not written down at first. Muhammad was probably illiterate. Well, the word, it's usually, the usual sense of it is illiterate. It can also mean not learned in the book sense. So there's some dispute about that. But in his initial vision, and in his visions in general, he saw the angel Gabriel, or Jibril, and he dictated the verses to him. And the first vision, the angel said, recite in the name of thy Lord who created man from a blood clot. Recite, thy Lord is most noble, who taught by the pen, taught men that which he knew not. And the language here, Arabic at the time, there was no literary Arabic. There was no poetic Arabic. Arabic was a practical language of primarily nomadic people. And if you were learned in that culture, you learned other languages to express poetry or expansive philosophical thoughts. But this was a kind of Arabic that was completely unknown until that time. So part of what brought people into Islam at first was the unprecedented power of the language used in such a novel way that it moved people to their bones, and was responsible for a good bit of the initial burst of enthusiasm of the religion in the early years. And so in addition to these visions creating the Quran, it also creates literary Arabic. I always compare it with Dante creating literary Italian, or Raymond Lull creating literary Catalan. But this is not just the act of a writer, but the act of someone who's receiving visions and writing those visions down and changing the nature of the language in a fundamental way. One of the most important verses in the Quran for Sufism is the verse of the lamp. It's Surah 24, verse 35. God is the light of the heavens and the earth. The parable of his light is a niche, wherein is a lamp. The lamp is in a glass. The glass is as a shining star kindled from a blessed olive tree, neither of the east nor of the west. Its oil would well nigh shine forth, even if no fire had touched it, light upon light. God guides unto his light whomsoever he will, and God set forth parables for mankind, and God is the knower of all things. So from the very beginning, the image of light is very central to Islam. And there is a prayer that is said by Sufis and Illuminationists, as we spoke of in the previous class, that was witnessed, Muhammad apparently saying this prayer in the hearing of one of his companions, Ibn Abbas. It's called the Prayer of Light. And as I read it, I'll pause, and perhaps you can internally recite the part of the line in yourself and feel the light in that part of you or outside you. O God, place light in my heart and light in my soul, light upon my tongue, light in my eyes, and light in my ears. Place light at my left, light at my right, light behind me, and light before me, light above me, and light beneath me. Place light in my nerves, and light in my flesh, light in my blood, light in my hair, and light in my skin. Give me light. Increase my light. Make me light. And we haven't even gotten to Sufism yet. This is all within the purview of Orthodox Islam. At this point, I'd like to introduce what's sometimes called the Sufi prayer. Hello? Did somebody have a question? I heard a sound.
No, no, sorry. I was just getting a message. Somebody sent me a message. Sorry.
Okay, no problem. This is called the Sufi invocation or the Sufi prayer. And can you mute possibly?
Okay.
Yeah, if you have questions, feel free to interrupt, but if you're having beeping, maybe just mute. I shouldn't say interrupt. If you have questions, feel free to speak up, but beeping is another question. This may be familiar to you. You may have seen this before. Toward the one, the perfection of love, harmony, and beauty, the only being, united with all the illuminated souls who form the embodiment of the Master, the spirit of guidance. Is this familiar to anyone? It's
very Platonic.
Oh, yeah, there's absolutely resonance. This was written by Inayat Khan, Hazrat Inayat Khan, who we'll talk about in more detail later. And the illustration at the top is the cover of a book called Sunseed by Inayat Khan's son, Vilayat Khan, or Pir Vilayat Khan, that came out shortly after Be Here Now, and by some of the same people, and had some a similar kind of vibration. I'd love to have another copy. It's very hard to come by nowadays, but it's very inspiring. You might get just a hit of it from that cover there. But so we begin. And from this lovely picture, I'm going to actually come to a kind of clunky diagram. It's actually from Wikipedia. Talk about, like, structurally, what is Sufism? And so in this chart, we can talk about how both on the outer layer of exoteric religion, and also the outer layer of esoteric religion, there is Sharia, following religious law, making your behavior impeccable. And then going towards the truth is tariqa. It's being on the path, which is generally participating in a Sufi order. And in the center, hakika is truth, or the real. So Sharia, hakika, and the movement from Sharia to hakika is tariqa, or Sufism. And then there is also marifa, which is gnosis, or mystical union. And you could say that it's the center of the circle of hakika, or you could say that it dissolves the entire diagram. Marifa. Very important to the Sufi tradition is the initiatic chain called silsila, which means chain. This illustration here is a listing of the steps of the people who passed on the knowledge. And it always starts with Muhammad, that all of the Sufi orders can trace their the hidden guidance, the thread of guidance from Muhammad to usually one of two of the original rightly guided caliphs, to use the Sunni terminology.
Would we call this a lineage?
Absolutely. In the case of the Naqshbandi Sufis, They trace back their silsila to Muhammad by way of Abu Bakr, who was the first successor, the first caliph after the death of Muhammad. But that's unusual. Almost all other Sufi orders, all other major ones, trace it back to Ali, who, from the Sunni perspective, is the fourth of the rightly guided caliphs. And if you're Shia, this is the first Imam, the first authority after Muhammad. They don't really recognize the first three successors that the Sunni do. That's the fundamental distinction between Shia and Sunni, the line of descent. But that has implications that spread out to their theology, their culture, every aspect of it. But one of the things about the Shia tradition, they don't usually have the same prohibitions about representative art. So we have an unusually realistic portrait that's probably either Persian or Turkish. But curious work there. But anyhow, so almost every, except for the Naqshbandi, all the major Sufi lineages are derived from Ali. But I did want to, there's a story about the origins of the Sunni-Shia split that I wanted to mention here, mostly just because it's interesting and not spoken of much. Aisha, now I'm the one that's getting buzzes. Let me make sure that that doesn't happen again. There we go, sorry about that. Aisha was was one of the wives of the Prophet, and she had accompanied him on a raid. And afterwards, the raiders had prepared to return home, but Aisha went looking for a missing necklace. Because everyone thought she was within her howdah, an enclosed bed on a camel, they accidentally abandoned her. It was customary for a man in the army to be appointed to make sure that no persons or supplies were left behind. On this occasion, it was Safwan ibn Mutal who discovered the Prophet's wife. He brought her back on his camel, and they caught up with the rest of the army in the morning. But people jumped to conclusions because the two of them had been alone together all night. Ali was thought to have advised the Prophet to be rid of her and select another wife, which led to animosity between Ali and Aisha that eventually led to the Battle of the Camel, the first civil war among Muslims, and the split between Sunni and Shiite. So the story of the silsila, the descent of the wisdom from Muhammad being passed on through the lineage, is the traditional story of Sufism's origins. But Henry Corbin, we've seen this picture in earlier classes, it's a fascinating, endlessly thoughtful French theologian, philosopher, and student of Islamic philosophy, teacher of Islamic philosophy. His theory is that the Shia perspective all along was that there was the guidance that was originally received from Muhammad continues with the Imam. Ali was the first Imam, and then that guidance, a divinely inspired guidance, passed along from one Imam to the next. So there's this continuity of a wisdom that is passed on then to all the devout. That doesn't really happen in Sunni Islam, even though there were rightly guided caliphs, and then there were later Umayyad caliphs and Abbasid caliphs and so on. They weren't considered to be the source of divine guidance so much as political leaders, hopefully devout, but just political leaders. In the Shiite world, there's this mystical sort of guru-student relationship between the Imam and the Shiite Muslim. And Henry Corbin's theory is that the ideas of the relationship of the Muslim to the Imam in Shia Islam got passed into Sunni Islam without the Imam, replacing it with the Sufi master or Sufi sheikh. That it's an imamate without imams. And then eventually there get to be Shiite Sufis. It's less common, but it does happen. But the general feeling within Shia Islam is that Shiism is a tariqa of its own that doesn't require special groups to lead people on that inward journey. I don't know if there's anyone else that follows Henry Corbin's theory along those lines at all, but I thought it was interesting and worth mentioning. So on to particular manifestations of Sufism. The Sufi lineage known as the Uwaisi is named after Uwais al-Qarni. And it's said that Uwais al-Qarni knew Muhammad and Muhammad knew him, and yet they never met. And so to be an Uwaisi is to receive spiritual initiation from someone without physically meeting them. So it's a lineage that does not require physical proximity. If you meet them in a visionary state, for instance, if there's a genuine initiation that goes on, then you would be an Uwaisi. I don't know if you've ever run into the magazine, the Sufism Journal, or seen any evidence of the International Association of Sufism, which is in California somewhere. The founders are contemporary Uwaisis.
They're self-certified Sufis?
Oh, well, they are other certified in their dreams, you know, in their visions. You wouldn't have evidence of it, but, you know, they would say that they got the initiation from outside them, but just not in the physical realm.
Not so that anyone else would know.
Right. Yep. And of course, all of these portraits of historical Sufi teachers, you know, unless they're modern photographs, these are all just complete speculative works of art that don't have anything to do with how anybody really looked. But this is somebody's idea of what Dhu'l-Nun, the Egyptian, Dhu'l-Nun al-Misri, looked like. Dhu'l-Nun, that actual name, it means Lord of the Fish, and is also a title of Jonah. But Dhu'l-Nun al-Misri is a very early Sufism, very early Sufi, from around 791 to 860 Common Era. He's believed to be the first to present Sufism in a systematic way. The name al-Misri, like Mizraim, means the Egyptian, and Dhu'l-Nun is thought to have been an ethnic Egyptian rather than one of the Greek or Arab immigrants more common in Egypt at that time. His name has been associated with Hermeticism and alchemy since at least the 9th century, and although some commentators have dismissed such claims, Peter Kingsley asserts that their historical nature can be, and since the start of this century, I suppose that's last century, has been established. Doubt has also been cast on the legend that Dhu'l-Nun could read Egyptian hieroglyphs. But in 2004, Egyptologist Okasha El-Dali verified that a manuscript of Dhu'l-Nun's shows him to be partially correct in translating hieroglyphs many centuries after knowledge of them was thought to have died out. Dhu'l-Nun provided the original definition of gnosis, marifa. We were just talking about marifa. He provided the original definition of it within Islamic mysticism, describing Gnostics as those who exist in God and contemplate his face within their hearts, so that he reveals himself to them in a way not accorded to others. He's also credited with being the first within Sufism to speak of the stages of the soul's path to God, depicting 7 steps, reminiscent of the 7 steps of the alchemist Zosimus. And the origin of the notion of the Kitab, the mystic guide of humanity, considered as the pole of the heavens, is popularly ascribed to Dhu'l-Nun. He is also believed to have been the editor of the commentary on the Quran written by Jafar al-Sadiq, the 6th Imam, himself rumored to have been involved with Hermeticism and alchemy. And lastly, Dhu'l-Nun was the teacher of the famous Sufi Sahl al-Tustari. But the emphasis here I wanted to make is that Dhu'l-Nun was an Egyptian. It seems that he was an initiated Egyptian somehow. So Dhu'l-Nun is thought of as the gateway of the Egyptian mysteries into Islamic mysticism. Then Abu Yazid al-Bastami, who's considered to be one of the early, most important Sufis. His grandfather had been Zoroastrian. He's known for having taught fana, or the dying in mystical union, and his constant ecstasy took him out of himself, was the beginning of what's called the Drunken school of Islamic mysticism, not in the sense of actually drinking alcohol, but in the sense of being out of yourself and being so lost in mystical union that you're in another state entirely. And I have a little passage from al-Bastami here. I contemplated my Lord with the eye of certitude after he had turned me away from all that is other than him, and illuminated me with his light. He then brought me to a knowledge of the marvels of his secret, and revealed to me his ipseity, his self. I contemplated my eye by means of his own ipseity. My light faded under his light, my strength vanished under his strength, my power under his power. Thus I saw my eye through his self. The greatness that I attributed to myself was in reality his greatness. My progression was his progression. After that, I contemplated him with the eye of truth, ayn al-haq, like hakika. And I said to him, who is he? He answered me, neither myself nor other than myself. When last I contemplated the truth by means of the truth, I lived the truth through the truth, and I subsisted in the truth by means of the truth, in an eternal present, without breath, without word, without hearing, without knowledge, until God had communicated to me a knowledge sprung from his knowledge, a language that proceeded from his grace, a look modeled on his light. Do we know who this is? Sufi saint being hanged. This is Mansur al-Hallaj. He was a student of Sahl al-Tustari's, who we recently mentioned had been a student in turn of Dhu'l-Nun. In his early years, he received the traditional dress of the Sufi, the white wool. Oh, I could have mentioned that the most common etymology of Sufi comes from suf, for wool, because they traditionally wore a white garment that marked them as aspiring to purity. On the other hand, There are those who think that there might be some derivation from Sophia, or even philosopher. Is there somebody that could possibly mute? No? Yeah, good. It was fun, whatever it was. Or possibly the Sufi might have come from the Ikhwan al-Safa, Safa Sufi, that we studied last time. But anyway, that garment of wool, Al-Hallaj in his early years received that traditional dress, and he taught in the usual Sufi way for a few years. But then he began to find that too restrictive, so he threw off his Sufi garment and began teaching to everyone without regard for convention in any way. And he taught that the goal, not just for Sufis, but for everyone, was union with God. Now, regular people regarded this as heresy, while Sufis and Shiites regarded it as speaking initiated secrets to people who were not prepared to receive them. So he was thrown in prison for 12 years and ultimately hanged, coming to be regarded in later ages as a kind of heroic martyr for religious ecstasy. Al-Ghazali is remembered for strengthening Islamic orthodoxy and of critiquing Aristotelianism in a famous work called The Incoherence of the Philosophers, which had considerable influence in later European debate, about the relationship of Aristotelianism, Platonism, and Christianity, and so forth. But he was also a student of Sufism, and he was the one who established the doctrine that Sharia and Tariqa, or Sufism, must always be in agreement. If someone expresses a Sufi doctrine that contradicts Sharia, that Sufi doctrine is mistaken. If someone interprets Sharia in a way that contradicts genuine Sufism, that interpretation of Sharia is mistaken. He was particularly critical of Batinis, such as myself, and a Batini would want a Sufism that was less bound by religious orthodoxy. But his formulation is probably why Sufism endured over time, rather than being extinguished out of suspicion of heresy. So, wanted to take a pause here and see if anybody has any questions or comments or things that they'd like to share at this point.
I have a question.
Okay.
What is distinctive about the teaching of the Sufis such that they're set apart from other groups?
Other parts within Islam, or apart from other wisdom ways?
You mentioned that Sufis need not be Muslims. I think that's especially true in India.
Well, it's a big debate now, right? There are, I think the majority opinion of Sufi lineages these days is that you do have to be Muslim. But there are some lineages, and they were ones that were more prominent in my experience when I was younger, as an American, as a Westerner, that are more relaxed about it. Or that don't have that requirement. And so, and how you talk about it, it's hard to find a way to talk about it that's neutral. If you're on the more universalist side, you might talk about universal Sufism. Where do I have that book? Like, for instance, this kind of famous book, Universal Sufism, that describes that Sufism is more of an underlying drive for wisdom that has always existed in humanity, and has just been expressed in a particularly lucid way in the traditional Sufi lineages. So you might call that universalist universal Sufism or universalist Sufism, but that kind of makes it sound like the other people, the ones who insist that you do have to be Muslim, they're not universal. They're somehow lesser. So that's kind of a biased way of putting it. Another way of talking about it is that if you don't require members to be Sufis to be a Muslim, that's neo-Sufism, and maybe I could get used to that. But it also has the sort of implication that if you are a Universalist, you're not a real Sufi, you're a neo-Sufi. So there's a tension going on that's very apparent as you start looking around at the different voices. That doesn't.
What is the essence of Sufism, such that we would use the word for it?
Well, if you are if you're not a Universalist, if you are from those lineages that would require you to be a Muslim, you'd say that Sufism is the inner understanding of Islam that leads students from the following the outer law to a gradual understanding of the inner truth through purification and exercises and acts of devotion and attention and a kind of inner alchemy to bring about a transformation and a depth of understanding that is not possible without that kind of inner effort. If, on the other hand, you are a Universalist Sufi, you might say that, there probably is a lot of difference depending on the lineage, but you might say that if someone is a well, no, that there is a particular view. It's not the view of Buddhism, where there's where you're affirming the underlying emptiness of all things. There's a presence, there's an essence. It's consistent with Platonism, but not with Buddhism. And there's a process of transformation that takes place that uses attention and a certain kind of work, but it also is not something that can be achieved through trial and error. You have to be studying with someone who understands the process of transformation and can guide you through it. And so it's a particular kind of inner alchemy that with a long lineage and a great deal of a large body of practical and theoretical knowledge to help someone go through that process of transformation. I mean, your question basically is, my answer to the question, to your question is this entire class. But if I was going to try to narrow it down to something smaller, that's where I would start.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. How are we doing? Anybody else? Okay. Well,
I have another question, and this is kind of a linguistic question. What does the word Imam mean?
I believe Imam simply means leader. But in the context of Shiism, there's a lot of doctrine about the meaning and implication of it, but we're talking about something like the living embodiment of God's guidance on earth for believers of the true religion.
Kind of like a pope?
Kind of like a cross between a pope and a guru. If you've ever looked into Aga Khan, who is kind of like a pope and a guru and a king. He is considered to be the Imam of the Ismailis, of that particular, the main branch of the Ismailis. But we'll talk more about the Ismailis next class.
And I think the Aga Khan Ismailis, that's the branch of Shia, right? Shia Muslims.
Yeah, they're a particular. All Ismaili Ismailis are Sevener Shias, as opposed to the main kind of Shia, who are Twelvers, saying that there were 12 imams before the last one went into occultation.
Okay.
The Seveners count 7 before their list is at the end.
Yeah.
But there's more than one kind of Ismaili, and the largest branch of the Ismailis is headed by the Aga Khan.
And can I add something?
Oh, please.
Yes, I just would like to add that I think Mrs. Austin, or Miss Austin, I'm sorry, I don't know how to properly for my English. I do apologize. I just like to add that when you ask about Imam, I mean, especially when it comes to Shia, like it's not just only Pope, and the Imams. It's for the Shia Muslims, it's they should be like ancestors of Prophet Muhammad. So if there is kind of like a parts of blood in the prophets of Prophet Muhammad, they can be the imams of the Shia Muslims. But right now, for Shia Muslims, it's not imams. It's only, they will say like a ayatollah. It's like I would say like a soul leaders, something like this. So all these 12 imams, there was ancestor of the Prophet Muhammad, and especially from his son-in-law, I think Ali.
They're descendants.
Oh, sorry, descendants, or not ancestors, yeah.
Thank you.
So is that, who's that, was that speaking? That was very helpful.
My name is Raynat, but you can call me Rain or Ray.
Okay, Rain, thank you very much for that. I appreciate it. And if there are other things that where you can help fill in the gaps, feel free to chime in.
Okay.
Moinuddin Chishti, who you could say that he's the person who brought Sufism to India and brought the Chishti Sufi order to India, which became the single largest manifestation of Islam in India in the Middle Ages. So pervasive influence. And it was really the first branch of Islamic mysticism, and this is Moinuddin Chishti's innovation, to allow the use of instrumental music. So now when we think of Qawwali and all of the other beautiful forms of Islamic devotional music, that's an innovation of this guy, Moinuddin Chishti. The Mughal Emperor Akbar, if you're, in India, it was conquered by the Mongols, and the dynasty that they established there are the Mughals, but they didn't, they created a kind of hybrid. They kept most of the Indian culture intact, but they did have a kind of encouragement of multiculturalism, of pluralism, so it was a particularly harmonious. The early Mughal Empire was a particularly prosperous and harmonious time in Indian history. And the Mughal Emperor Akbar was a Chishti devotee. And he took the Chishti concept of sul-i-kul, or peace with all, as a basis for religious tolerance within a pluralistic India. And the reputation that India had for a long time of religious tolerance and pluralism really stems from this. I mean, in recent decades, that's not the reputation that they've come to have, unfortunately. But to the extent that they do and did, that comes from Moinuddin Chishti. And the Persian poet Atar of Nishapur. This is one of Sufism's most influential poets. And his most famous poem is sometimes called The Conference of the Birds, or Parliament of the Birds, or in this translation that I can recommend, The Speech of the Birds. This one is translated by Peter Avery and is from Fons Vita Text, Fons Vita Press. And I can highly recommend it, not only, unlike the more popular translations that you find, it has the complete text with the prefaces and everything, but it has hundreds of pages in small type of footnotes explaining everything that you might need to know as a non-Persian, non-Muslim to be able to get the nuances of all of what's going on with the Sufi classic. And it's if there was any one book on Sufism in general, I would recommend it's this lovely tome. But in his poetry, he expresses the quests of how purification and religious union, mystical union, go hand in hand. The obstacles that we experience along the way, overcoming them, falling short, the sweetness of being embraced by the divine. And that particular poem, the main one I'm familiar with, is an incredible experience of that. I'd love to be able to quote some of it, but no part of it really does it justice. You kind of have to immerse yourself in it. But the Conference of the Bird, the general story is that there are all the birds want to go and have a meeting with the king of the birds, the Simurgh, which is a sort of mythical, big, mythical Persian bird. And so they go on a quest, and they go through 7 valleys, and they go through all these hardships, and all of the birds and the difficulties they experience, they correspond to challenges of the spiritual path. And in between every one of those instances, there are parables and allegories and stories within stories that reflect on one another and the overall story, until finally, after all of the hardships, by the end of the 7th valley, only 30 birds remain out of all of the birds that began the quest. But then once they are there, once they are in the final palace of the king of the birds, they realize that, and it's a pun in Persian that you can only conceive of from hearing it described, that Simurgh in Persian is 30 birds. So they find, after all of this effort, that they collectively are what it was that they were seeking on this quest the whole time. Omar Surawardi. So you might remember a Surawardi from the Illuminationists that we talked about last time. And I always said Shahabuddin Surawardi to distinguish him from this guy. Turns out he is also Shahabuddin Surawardi. But this, who we're looking at right now, is Shahabuddin Omar al-Surawardi, and the Illuminationist is Shahabuddin Yahya al-Surawardi. So I'll try to keep that straight next time. This Surawardi wrote the Arif ul-Marif, or the Knowledge of the Spiritually Learned, which is one of the principal guidebooks of the Sufi path that's been used for centuries as a guide to discipline. He's also an important figure in the development of, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing this correctly, Futuwa, or Islamic chivalry, which has Sufi principles, but extends into all branches of society, particularly the trades. You know, Western chivalry we think of as having to do with nobility, but Islamic chivalry started with Sufis, went out into trades. You don't have to be a Sufi. You can be chivalrous. You can have these principles of decency and virtue, and that you know, light up your light and provide an example for everyone. As a tradesman, and then eventually got to the nobility too, but it's a kind of different conception of chivalry than what we have in the West. But it's a very important part of that culture. And here's that picture of Ibn Arabi from the Turkish TV show that I was telling you about. But how to talk about Ibn Arabi, Ibn al-Arabi, if you like. The greatest sheikh, he's called, Sheikh Al-Akbar. He's born in Spain in 1165, and he traveled to the east and died in Damascus in 1240. He was enormously prolific and very influential all throughout all Islam, Sunni, Shia, Illuminationist. But some of us have been reading the Ringstones of Wisdom in our Ibn Arabi reading group for more than a year, and can attest to how very challenging he is in the easiest chapters. And most of them are not the easiest chapters. He's a very challenging writer to read, to try to wrap one's head around. But his importance is incomparable. He's kind of considered to be the beginning of a golden age of Sufism that we're still in. I did have a passage from Henry Corbin writing on Ibn Arabi that I thought maybe I would offer in place of trying to come up with some kind of summary myself. The divine abyss conceals the mystery of the hidden treasure that aspires to be known, and that creates creatures in order to become in them the object of its own knowledge. Let me say that again. The hidden treasure aspires to be known and creates creatures in order to become in them the object of its own knowledge. This revelation of the divine being is accomplished in the form of a succession of theophanies characterized by 3 stages: the epiphany of the divine essence to itself, which can only be spoken of by allusion; a second theophany, which is the sum total of all the theophanies in and through which the divine essence reveals itself to itself in the forms of the divine names, that is to say, in the forms of beings such as they exist in the secret of the absolute mystery; and a third theophany in the forms of concrete individuals, which bestows upon the divine names a concrete and manifest existence. These names exist from all eternity within the divine essence and are this very essence, because the attributes which they designate, although they are not identical with the divine essence as such, are nevertheless not different from it. So by these names, you may have heard the expression, the 99 names of God. This comes from Islam, and they're names that generally are found in the Quran, that are names of God, you know, like the Al-Rahman, Al-Rahim, the compassionate, the merciful, Kafi, Al-Shafi, the healer, the remedy. And Allah is considered to be the greatest of all of the names, the most comprehensive of all of those names. But Ibn Arabi has a metaphysical structure where the unspeakable mystery of God has a reflection in these names that are in a sense attributes of him, but because they are attributes of something so great, they have a metaphysical status of themselves. They're like a Neoplatonic hypostasis. And these names are the vehicles through which specific creatures manifest as creative projections of the names. So other folks in the Reading Ibn Arabi group How are we doing so far? Does that sound like what we usually talk about when we read Ibn Arabi?
Yes. Short answer.
Okay. Me up to y'all or to anybody who has something to say about Ibn Arabi. Do you want to pitch in here? He's just too big a subject. Or not. No is also a valid answer. Ibn Arabi is a philosopher of non-duality, of a fundamental unity, but is always trying to communicate how can we talk about a transcendental unity that contains everything while trying to speak to our apparent multiplicity, and while not wanting to negate or while wanting to grant that multiplicity its own kind of validity. How do you do that in a way that in no way contradicts the fundamental depth and scope of the oneness? And so that's, and he's always doing it in different ways. Every page, every paragraph, he's coming to it freshly and trying to communicate it in ways that stretch language to their breaking point. And, you know, sometimes the brains of those of us who are trying to grapple with it.
Are there parallels to Samkhya Yoga, to what you just spoke on, of kind of holding the dualisms in check, but the fundamental non-dual principle of the teaching?
Somebody could do a great book, if they haven't already, on that subject. I personally find that there's something to him more resonant with like a Kashmir Shaivite, like Abhinavagupta, in that the life is very real. It's not, and I'm not saying that Advaita in its real form does that habit of, oh, that's just your that's just the story, but it can be interpreted that way. And Ibn Arabi is very much a transcendent and immanent, lived and lived and beyond life. So I think that there's something amazing to be discovered in an exploration of like what you're talking about. I hope that you answer that.
The Vedanta is much more non-dual and negative of the external, or at least moving inwards through the tamas, rajas, and sattva realms of reality. But with the Samkhya, what I was always drawn to was it was kind of the one that didn't negate, that still understood that there are oppositions in need of some kind of, alchemical sacred marriage into that non-dual.
Very cool. But let us move on. Rumi, here's a statue from Turkey of the beloved poet Rumi. And this is very popular, possibly the most popular of the Sufis. His poetry of love and his founding of the Mevlevi Sufis, who are the ones who are famous for their whirling. So the whirling dervishes, the spinning, and sort of attaining the axis of consciousness, of still consciousness in the endless motion of the energies of life. And there's a dramatic story there of the love of his friend Shamsi Tabriz, that at a certain point he meets meets Shams and just loves him so, and he becomes the sort of muse of his poetry of love and divine love and life, and then Shams disappears, and then there's anguish and years of doubt and agony, and also poems of absence and longing, and then ultimately Shams becomes kind of an inner presence, his kind of inner guide, his own sort of inner Imam, if you like, that guides his work and his writing, and he ultimately produces his masterpiece, the Mathnawi-i Malawi, of which the preface was shared in the, or the opening poem is shared in the recommended readings that I gave. But I had actually, there's a small poem, what did I do with it? Excuse me. Small poem by Rumi in this book that I just got by A.H. Almas, Love Unveiled. And I thought actually it's concise and sweet and would be worth sharing here. This is love, to fly heavenward, to rend every instant 100 veils, the first moment to renounce life, the last step to fare without feet, to regard this world as invisible, not to see what appears to oneself. O heart, I said, may it bless thee to have entered the circle of lovers, to look beyond the range of the eye, to penetrate the windings of the bosom. There's such an amazing sweetness and depth to Rumi. And I'm not sure that I feel completely qualified to comment on him. I don't know if any of y'all are enthusiasts of Rumi or have anything that you want to share or comment on about him or his work or the reading. Well, you know, he's become very popular in recent decades in America because of the translations of Coleman Barks. And I think that academics say that Coleman Barks's translations are maybe not always entirely accurate, but they are certainly sweet. And I think that they've brought a lot of inspiration to people for bringing that message of a love that's both in the world and beyond the world simultaneously. So I brought this picture out. I wanted to talk about historical connections with Sufism and other things. And it's mostly just because it's such a fun picture here. We have the Mughal emperor, and he's rather talking with the Sufi the Sufi sheikh than all of the other visitors, the Ottoman emperor who's come to see him, and in the corner there with the fancy hat, it's King James I of England, of England and Scotland, of Great Britain, in this wild picture. And so generally in these classes, I bring up these various traditions because what role do they have to play in the Illuminist tradition, in the Western mystery tradition? And there are some particular things that perhaps we can point at, especially if we don't necessarily accept the traditional Sufi origins, that the only thing that Sufism owes is to the wisdom that begins with Muhammad, and there are no other influences. If we take that hat off and we put on more of a comparative religion hat, we can see doctrinal resonances with Pythagoreanism and Neoplatonism. And we can see influences from Sufism outside of Islam. For instance, the son of the Maimonides who wrote the what is it, the Guide for the Perplexed, was Abraham Maimonides, and he wound up participating in a Sufi circle as a Jew, and then brought a mix of Jewish mysticism and Sufism into a circle that was basically Sufi in structure and in orientation, but within a cultural tradition that was predominantly Jewish, but also accepted Muslims. And this went on for many years after his death. So there was for a while, an ongoing tradition of a Jewish-Muslim synthesis of a kind of Sufism in that place. And I don't think that's the only place where that's happened either. We see in the story of Christian Rosenkreuz in the beginning of Rosicrucianism, which we'll get to in later classes, but that he travels to the Middle East and studies the Book M, and it seems to point to an awareness at that time that there are these schools of wisdom that that used to exist in classical times, in ancient Greece, and in Greco-Roman times, and in Egypt. There were these circles that cultivated wisdom that that kind of disappeared with the advent of Christianity, because the goal was not to become wise, but to become saintly. And so I think that there got to be, especially around the time of the Protestant Reformation, this sense that there is no Christian equivalent to the Sufis, and there ought to be. But I don't have specific examples of how this transmission occurred specifically. But I mean, we've seen some already, that Raman Lal was acquainted himself with certain Sufi teachings and brought over the idea of the belover and the beloved in Christian devotional mystical discourse. Dante had some influence, maybe just from Avicenna. Chaucer may have had some influence from the Muslim culture in Andalusia. Egyptian Freemasonry in the 1800s may have had some participation with actual Sufis, who may have helped them bring some real Eastern wisdom in, while they were busy faking Eastern wisdom at the same time. Even Madame Blavatsky, who was a notorious con woman, was friends with Sufi teachers who may have had some influence in her strange mix of doctrines. And of course, we've already mentioned Henry Corbin, who was deeply steeped in Shia mysticism, Ismailianism, and to some extent Sufism. And I also want to mention René Guénon, who I'm not thoroughly steeped in, but he was initiated as a Sufi, as a Shadili Sufi, among others, and wrote on Sufism in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and had a lot of criticisms about Western culture and secularism, and the feebleness of Western religious institutions. On the other hand, some people accuse his ideas of cultivating certain kinds of right-wing politics, and there's a battle going on. Did he or did he not? So I have not really studied him, but there's no doubt that he was a gateway for some inflow of Sufi ideas, especially into Europe during his life, and was one of the founders of the traditionalist movement, for better or for worse. But then we get to the unambiguously good people. Hazrat Inayat Khan, who I mentioned earlier, wrote the Sufi prayer that toward the one that towards the beginning of our class. He was a superstar of a particular kind of Indian classical music in his earlier years. Was the person carrying forward a certain genre of music that he was adored for. But at the same time, he also studied under a Sufi teacher and was very inspired by it. And he felt called to bring the Sufi message to Westerners. But that meant, among other things, he had to leave India and give up his musical career. And that entire genre of Indian music went extinct without his continued participation. So there is something lost there. But he was a very devoted and focused teacher. He started the Sufi Order of the West, which is the ancestor of most of the manifestations of Sufism that Europeans and Americans are likely to have come across. That's certainly true in my own case. If you've seen the winged heart as a Sufi symbol, that is, as far as I know, that is from his lineage. So that'll give you some idea of how pervasive, how widely spread his teachings and his people are. His son, Vilayat Khan, at the time known as Pir Vilayat Khan, Pir is like the head of a Sufi order, he inherited the Sufi order in the West and became known, very widely known in his books and his teaching in the UK and Europe and America. He appears in Be Here Now and a lot of other things that were current to the 60s psychedelic awakening. And that was his book, The Sunseed, when we looked at the Toward the One prayer. That illustration, the front cover, was a book of his doing. An amazing person. I got to see him speak once while he was still alive, and his presence was just really sweet and amazing. And his sister, Noor Khan, is not known precisely for being a Sufi teacher, but she was known that despite she's more or less a princess, because these are all like Indian aristocratic families, served in the British Army in intelligence in World War II. And during the Nazi occupation of France, she was sending and decrypting messages, and she had the opportunity again and again to be able to be rescued, to be pulled out, because she was such a valuable asset. But she considered it her duty to continue to make extraordinary efforts in the face of incredible danger to help the war effort. And she was ultimately captured, and the Nazis made note of the incredible resilience and resistance that she had to all of their interrogation methods, and never gave up anything, and died in prison. And now there are monuments to her, movies to her, and most especially this last year, she was a character in Doctor Who. I don't know if you saw this. I had to pinch myself. Noor Khan is in, the doctor visits Vichy, France, and meets Noor Khan, who crucially helps the adventure and saves the day. So yeah, that's her. Now, moving away from that family for a moment, Samuel Lewis, Murshid Samuel Lewis, also known as Sufi Sam. So if you've ever done any dances of universal peace, sometimes called Sufi dancing, and it's all over the world, especially in the United States, but everywhere, that was his invention. He was a disciple of Inayat Khan's in the pretty early days, and also studied Zen in great depth. And then in the 60s, he had this inspiration that it was his mission. God had called on him to teach the flower children to dance. And he knew a great choreographer and worked with her on a large set of core dances for teaching that people could just come into a circle in the same meeting and learn to participate in these dances of devotion and sweetness and love. And it was incredibly successful. And there aren't very many places where you can't find dances of universal peace happening somewhere near you. And if you haven't, you really should. The energy, the experience is wonderful. And he, from that, started a group called the Sufi Ruhaniyat International, or SRI, or just the Ruhaniyat order. That's Ruhaniyat is breathing together, Ruh for spirit. And they're all over the world. Some of the centers are in California. I've been to some of them, through some amazing people. And one curious, fun thing about Samuel Lewis that not everyone knows is, the underground cartoonist R. Crumb. He mostly based his famous character, Mr. Natural, on Sufi Sam. So while Flaky Funt is getting his mind blown by Mr. Natural, there's some of the transmission of Sufi Sam, dance teacher to the hippies, being brought along with that. Inayat Khan's grandson, son of Vilayat Khan, Zia Khan, is the current head of what was the Sufi order in the West, and which is now known as the Inayati, after Inayat Khan. And his writings and lectures are very inspirational. I can certainly recommend that. But so currently the different major branches of the lineage of Inayat Khan are the Inayati, the Sufi Ruhaniyat International out from Sufi Sam. There's the Sufi movement, which is descended from the guy who wrote Universal Sufism. They're mostly in Europe. They're particularly non-hierarchical. Then there's also the Sufi Way, which is headed by a fellow named Elias Amidon, who has an interesting blending of Sufi teachings and non-duality, and is someone I think is well worth checking out. Another of the lineage of the Western Sufis, one that I know less, are the Naqshbandi in the West, starting with Irina Tweedy, who lived from 1907 to 1999, and she was the first Western woman to be initiated into the Naqshbandi order. And she kept a diary on the advice of her sheikh of the spiritual transformations that she underwent during her Sufi training. Again, on the suggestion of her teacher, had it published in a book that is called Daughter of Fire, which became a spiritual classic and bestseller. She passed on her branch of the Naqshbandi lineage to Llewellyn Vaughan-Lee, who has founded the Golden Sufi Center as an institution for passing along the Naqshbandi teachings. He's a very interesting writer and lecturer. He's very engaged in trying to save the environment. So he has warnings that are that will shake you to the core. He's concerned, as we all should be, that he's especially good at communicating the depths of what's going on. So he's not always not always an easy encounter. Those of us who are enthusiasts of Peter Kingsley might know that he's been a promoter and publisher of Kingsley's books. So he's got that going on. And then on another branch entirely, there's Idris Shaw, who did the last in the recommended readings, The Islanders. And what to say about Idris Shaw? Rascal. You know, there's the tradition of the rascal guru, the trickster, and there is no doubt that Idris Shaw falls into that category. But for all of his trickery, I think that there's no doubt that he's authentic. Maybe he doesn't have all the lineages, all the titles that he may have said he did in some grandiose mood or another, but there are amazing things that he taught and did. He wrote the original book, The Sufis, which introduced Sufism to the West on a very large scale. It was introduced by Robert Graves, so people that were into Robert Graves immediately picked up that book, and it made a big impression. And it's such a fascinating thing. You know, it's like the introduction. The Islanders is what I shared in the shared readings, in the suggested readings. But in the course of the book, it has no linear order. It'll take you through this dimension and that dimension and the other dimension, and he challenges your assumptions and at every stage and in different ways. So he really makes you think. In that book, The Sufis, among other things, he has a chapter dedicated to the builders, which is an explanation of how much of Freemasonry has its origins in a Sufism, and before that, in the wisdom of ancient Egypt. And that Dhu'l-Nun al-Misri, who we spoke of before, he founded the sect known as the Builders, and they actually were descendants of the building guilds dedicated to the Egyptian god Ptah, and that many of those same customs and signs and symbols and things found their way into Freemasonry in Europe and England. And if you research this, you find endless papers by Freemasons who are quoting Idris Shaw. And I've been looking and looking, and I've been asking Muslims and Arabic speakers and historians, and I have never found any reason to believe that there is the least bit true to it, other than what, you know, a bit earlier than what Idris Shaw wove in the book The Sufis. But if it isn't true, it deserves to be. And there's a lot of Idris Shaw that's like that. Idris Shaw is also known for popularizing the Nasruddin stories in the West. So the Nasruddin is a sort of goofy trickster Sufi, perhaps. He's a sheikh, he's an authority, and he's the source of countless jokes in the Middle East. And Idris Shaw published these books that are they just kitsch, or are they teaching stories? And it's never entirely clear. Let me pass on a couple of these. The first one's called Do Not Disturb the Camels. Nasruddin was wandering in a graveyard. He stumbled and fell into an old grave. Beginning to visualize how it would feel if he were dead, he heard a noise. It flashed into his mind that the angel of reckoning was coming for him, though it was only a camel caravan passing by. The mullah jumped up and fell over a wall, stampeding several camels. The camelteers beat him with sticks. He ran home in a distressed state. His wife asked him what the matter was and why he was late. I have been dead, said the mullah. Interested in spite of herself, she asked him what it was like. Not bad at all, unless you disturb the camels. Then they beat you. All right, so one more. The secret. A would-be disciple haunted Nasruddin, asking him question after question. The mullah answered everything and realized that the man was not completely satisfied, although he was in fact making progress. Eventually the man said, "Master, I need more explicit guidance." "What is the matter?" "I have to keep on doing things, and although I progress, I want to move faster. Please tell me a secret, as I have heard you do with others." "I will tell you when you are ready for it." The man returned later to the same theme. "Very well. You know that your need is to emulate me?" "Yes." "Can you keep a secret?" "I would never impart it to anyone." "Then observe that I can keep a secret as well as you can." So, before we close up, I was wondering, does anybody have more that they'd like to share or questions that they'd like to ask?
I just want to thank you. This has been really fascinating. And out of all the traditions, I've never studied any Islamic or Muslim studies yet, but I've always been really drawn to Sufism as this kind of, integral coalescence of so much. So I'm looking forward to future lectures.
Well, thank you. There is well, I mean, maybe less so with the lockdown, but intrinsically, there is a very active Sufi scene in Portland. So if you're just coming to town, there are many really wonderful Sufi groups that you can hang out with and find out about, especially probably once the lockdown is over, but something to consider as time goes on. Because it's like, I'm speaking as an outsider, but people who are interested in Sufism, there are Sufis to talk to, there's Sufis to hang out with, there's Sufi things to do, and they're discreet, so that doesn't always come to people's attention, but it's a wonderful thing and I can recommend it. And in general, if I was going to try to sum up, it's just, I'm so grateful for the legacy of Sufism and for the presence of Sufism, that in fantasy stories we imagine, or writers imagine, sources of great wisdom, sources that enable the story to change fundamentally. But this is something that's really there, people that are really doing it, and in considerable numbers in all kinds of ways, and every place that you enter into in Sufism opens out into vast vistas that are unique to that particular lineage, or that particular even that particular teacher, and the riches, the treasures are just endless. And it's, I think, a testimony to the great generosity of being that that grace on this level can be found. And so to the Sufi tradition, and to the Sufi masters, and to the Sufi practitioners, I'm just very grateful. Thank you for having been there and being there and continuing to be there. And thank y'all for joining for tonight for this talk. I'm glad we could get together, and I hope you'll be here when we get together next time to talk about Arabic Hermeticism. So until then, I'll bid you good night.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Good night.
Thank you. Looking forward to the next one.
All right, fantastic. Thanks. Bye.
Good night.
Good night.